trying to understand, how people view content, the important context that goes around that, how it changes and evolves by market, even down to the household level, and what kind of insights can be shared and that can be actioned upon in some kind of scale for marketers to benefit from it. So those are the kind of things when we talk about, the future of television that we talk about here at Time Warner Cable.
Great, Fred. That's terrific insight, and I'm sure we'll have some questions based on some of your comments. Next, I'd like to introduce Emil Rensing, who's Chief Digital Officer at Epix. Tell us a little bit about Epix and yourself, and then let's have the benefit of your vision for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, it's been a great ride over here at Epix for the last couple of years. Really trying to position our business in a way to actually take advantage of a lot of the trends and changes that we see happening. So, from our perspective, Epix is a cable television network. We're owned and essentially operated by 3 movie studios. We basically own their first-run theatrical output in the pay television window, where Paramount, Lionsgate, and MGM might have traditionally had output deals with Showtime or HBO or Starz. Those titles are ours, and they're ours exclusively in that pay television window. You won't see those on a first-run basis on any of the other pay networks out there. Where our business becomes interesting and ultimately very flexible is the fact that our grant of right from our studio partners isn't limited to distribution and delivery via coaxial cable. Our business, we're basically free and clear to license our product to anyone that sort of meets our business criteria, regardless of the technology platform in place. When we initially launched the business, we went to market with Verizon Fios, and we very quickly added a very controversial distribution partner to our portfolio in Netflix. We're the only suppliers of first-run theatrical output programming to Netflix. All of that comes out of the Epix library. It's titles that we've licensed from the studios, and as we've grown our distribution footprint, we are now in the majority of cable TV households, thanks to our friends over at Time Warner Cable, and are working really, really hard to flex those rights we have to those titles to help folks who are trying to push the boundaries of products across the board, solve and service rather, the consumer needs that are sort of evolving and changing as time goes on. So yes, in addition to having deals with cable operators and satellite providers and fiber providers, we do work with Netflix. We do work with Amazon Prime. As part of our Dish Network deal, we spend some time working with the folks over at Blockbuster.com. Our Verizon deal sort of extends into their Redbox products. So, we're in a lot of interesting places. From our perspective, our goal is to be as flexible as possible. It's not necessarily up to us to sort of determine what that future is for, the big guys in the space, like the Time Warner Cables in the world, some of the more, focused players like the Verizon Fioses. But these guys are innovating products at a very, very impressive rate. They're putting new things into market. We're working with them on new ways to get programming in front of their audiences at different price points, with different feature sets, with different tools. And that's really the thing that I think, from our perspective, we try to focus on. It's about listening to the customers. It's about paying attention to the trends in the world. And when your partners are coming in and they're trying to solve problems to meet their customers' needs, having the flexibility to actually bring something to market to help everybody put a great product out there.
Thank you very much, Emil. Our next speaker is Seth Shapiro, who's Governor Interactive Media for the Television Academy. Seth?
Hi. Hi, Jim. Yeah, I'm happy to be here today. So, to that point, I'm a governor of Interactive Media at the Television Academy, and obviously we're coming out of the Emmys this week, so this is the kind of stuff that we look at a lot in terms of forming the rules and the go-forward strategy for the Emmys going into every year. And obviously this is a fast and furious time. I'm also a writer and analyst in the space in TV, digital, and private equity, and I guess what really hits me, and these guys are echoing it, is that traditionally this conversation would be about content and distribution, and so many new factors are hitting all of them, both of those, and then additionally there's really intriguing new matters to be determined, which is, for example, who owns the customer, right? So traditionally in our business, the customer was owned by an MVPD. The customer was not owned by a company like Epix or HBO. we're seeing, the beginning of movement in that area. Data, we would have talked about a few years ago relative to analytics and operational data in terms of usage and consumption, but now data in terms of household as broadband becomes far and away the most intriguing part of the MVPD service solution. We're looking at data, we're looking at tier 1 versus tier 2, we're looking at caps and all of the TBD issues around how data is provisioned to the home. And I think there's also a really interesting thing, just as a data point, around content and how it plays out in the funding of content. In the funding of all of this great stuff, probably, in the 3 or 4 network era, we were looking at, probably 60 or 70 scripted dramas going on per year. This year, we're looking at somewhere between 350 and 400 scripted dramas. That's astounding. So regardless of what else you say, I mean, I think we clearly are in the most exciting era in the history of television. I'm actually writing a book on the history and future of TV, and you go back and you look at great shows and what was on in these eras that people sort of throw around the term golden relative to. And while we were queuing up for this, I just went online and started queuing up shows that are on the air right now really quickly. The Good Wife, Blacklist, SNL, Modern Family, Scandal, Glee, Simpsons, Boardwalk Empire, Girls, Game of Thrones, True Detective, Veep, Derek, House of Cards, Orange is the New Black, Better Call Saul, Mad Men, Walking Dead, Homeland, Masters of Sex, Ray Donovan, Luther, Doctor Who, American Horror Story, Bridge, Fargo, Justified, Louis, and Sons of Anarchy. So roughly 30 shows that in another era, I think you could argue would have been one of the great shows in that era of television, and they're all on now, and so clearly that leads to a bunch of interesting discussions about future business models.
That is, Seth, and I think we'll get back to that. But before last, and by no means least, is Mitch Singer. Mitch is a longtime friend of mine, I have to admit, and somebody I always like to go to and ask what's going on, so I'm glad to have him on the panel. He had been a senior executive with Sony Pictures Entertainment and now is president of good old DECE, better known as Ultraviolet. Mitch?
Thank you, Jim, and I'm really happy to be here. Before we start talking about disruption in industry, it's kind of, I like to level set on what disruption means, to me and many others. And if you think just about the definitional, term of disruption, to tear apart, to interrupt, to shatter, and really that's what we're talking about. We're talking about things that change the way the incumbents think about business models. And you can almost think about disruption in one of two ways. One way is to think about disruption as a threatening force that threatens your existing business model, and what you try to do is kind of stop them. And we see that in the marketplace today. We saw it with the incumbents against Aereo, for example. That was a new, innovative way to access television set, but it disrupted the incumbents as you know, Aereo's business model was deemed a copyright infringement by recent U.S. Supreme Court decision. And it's not all about media and technology. I mean, just look at what Sheldon Adelson, for example, is doing to try to shut down online gambling, because he happens to be one of the largest casino owners in the world. So we see the way incumbents treat disruption all the time. And I don't think that's very productive. Another way to look at it is to say, okay, let's go with it. Let's look for new business models with the new technologies. And that's kind of where I think the focus ought to be. And when you think about disruption, one of the four key parameters that I look at with a disruptive technology is, first, it enables a population of less skilled people to do what previously only highly skilled people can do. And we see that all the time, especially in the piracy area of accessing content. It reshapes existing businesses to earn profits in a new way. New way doesn't mean more. Many times, actually, new way means less. We can look at the music industry. And even from motion picture distribution, we can look at how subscription on demand is impacting revenues from more of a transactional video on demand. It facilitates existing patterns of consumer behavior rather than trying to change consumer behavior. And that's really important. And if you remember, in the music industry, the first two disruptive services that launched were actually subscription music services, Press Play and Rhapsody. and it was not adopted by any consumers because consumers' behavior at the time was to buy albums, to buy CDs. And it took what? Now we're 10, 12 years later, and now we see music subscription services finally starting to catch on. But 10 years to change consumer behavior. And lastly, I like to think of disruption or disruptive adaptive business models as focusing on specific customer needs and brands, and then build on the consumer need. So when I think about what you need to do when you're faced with disruption, the first thing is you have to adopt it because it's simply not going to go away. Now, the motion picture industry has often been criticized for being the incumbent, for being I don't want to say Luddite, but in a way, let's call them Luddites. But if you really look at what's happened in the motion picture industry, is the moment we started to see pay TV and subscription services start to launch, or we can even go back to the launch of television itself. The motion picture studios always kind of like cry, and then ultimately find a way to monetize it. So pay TV and subscription was huge growth. We know what happened with VHS and the Boston Strangler comment by Jack Valenti. And what did we see in VHS? We saw huge growth ultimately. DVD as a sell-through. First time we came out with digital movies on optical disc. Again, huge growth. And now we see digital delivery. And quite frankly, the growth of digital is yet to be determined. And in fact, coming as a studio executive, I actually thought digital growth would be huge. And I just saw something from Price Waterhouse that estimated digital EST, electronic sell-through growth in 2017 will be 6%. That's not a very good forecast. And so why? Why is digital growth estimated to be so slow? Well, the first thing is, I think when people predict future growth, they base it on what they see today in the marketplace. And what we see in the marketplace today isn't a really great consumer proposition. I mean, everyone here is talking about meeting consumer demand and consumer needs, but we do see a lot of proprietary platforms out there still trying to capture the consumer, and it's in that proprietariness that we see consumers, I think, finding other ways to access content. So what we really need to find is, and we're moving towards it slowly, is to make sure consumers have huge selection of content, whether it's television or movies, independent films. The big screen isn't going away, so they're going to have to be able to view content not only on the big screen, but on mobile as well. The acquisition experience needs to be easier. If I see it digitally, I ought to be able to buy it. That's not quite the case today. It's not like I'm walking through a Walmart store and I see a DVD at the checkout counter. That impulse buy does not yet exist digitally. We need to see, increased or unlimited storage. We're getting there with cloud services, certainly with whether it's iTunes or Amazon or any other locker. We need to make sure consumers have access. Access not only on any device, but access from any service, which Ultraviolet is trying to move towards. And of course, you need to be able to keep track of what you own. So I think what we're going to start seeing is we're going to start seeing new cloud services launch that enable consumers to access all of their digital content in one place. And it doesn't have to be movies here, music there, and photos all over the place. It's going to be a cloud service that allows consumers to store everything. The future of disruption is going to be very, very interesting because we haven't seen the huge impacts yet. For example, Netflix is capitalized at about $28.5 billion. HBO's estimated to be worth $20 billion. That's kind of an odd capitalization considering HBO is much more profitable. And in fact, HBO probably has a competitive advantage, a much bigger library of premium content, first pay windows from Universal, Warner Brothers, and Fox. And but they're in a kind of an old system of subscriptions, at least in the US, with cable operators. So what happens when HBO finally goes over the top and reaches consumers in the same way Netflix? Is that what Rupert thought, for example, when he was valuing Time Warner at $85 or $90 billion? Probably value was coming out of HBO. The other thing that I think we're going to see is, and again, we'll see what actually happens, because I do think it's going to be game-changing, is after the Comcast-Time Warner merger, will we see Comcast Service Xfinity offer programming outside of the footprint, going after existing cable services territories with an over-the-top video service? That will also be game-changing. So we're going to see a lot of disruption going forward. But I think in the end, if the consumer ends up on top, even if some of the incumbents lose a little revenue here and there, I actually think it's probably a really good thing, because in the end, I think the consumer is king, because the access points are growing tremendously, and now consumers get to decide how they want the content and where they want to, on what device and where they want to receive it from. So I think it's going to be fun to watch over the next 3 to 5 years on how things change.
Thanks, Mitch. I love the comment about disruptive technology. In fact, the interesting thing is that disruptive technology is nothing new at all. It's quite old. In fact, you can look back to Gutenberg, as Breyer said, the Grokster oral argument, Justice Breyer. You know, the monks are really pissed at Gutenberg. And actually, he said it in a funny, sort of humorously, but it was, I mean, you talk about incumbents reacting, because one of the results of the Gutenberg press was Martin Luther. And the way the Catholic Church dealt with that was to burn people at the stake if they read the Bible and went Martin Luther's way. So, Mitch has heard me complain about incumbents, not going with disruption. At least they weren't as bad as the church was back then. So I'm going to start asking some questions, and Fred, I'm going to start with you, and others after Fred answers or says I have no clue. But no, Fred's smarter than that. I would say I have no clue. Duck it. Please let me know if you want to comment. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. So this is more. I'm more a techno geek, of course, as Mitch knows, and it's more sort of a technological question moving into disruptive technology in terms of content distribution, which is, of course, a big piece of what Time Warner Cable does. So my question is, how long before the big television transmission towers fall? Today, traditional broadcasters, as you know, are sitting on a large chunk of valuable spectrum. There's talk of, they're trying to put together an auction, but the number of viewers actually watching over-the-air television is shrinking. One statistic claims that only 8% of video viewers rely solely on over-the-air television. So will over-the-air television disappear, and will in their place be operators of an advanced transmission small stick standard? That's a very crazy way of talking about 4G, which is LTE Advanced Plus. Do you see them entering this field? I know Verizon tested transmitting the Super Bowl in New York, the last Super Bowl. What do you think, Fred?
It's an excellent question. Some of that from a technical standpoint, I'm not sure if I'm the right person, but I can tell you, broadly speaking, we talk a lot about broadcast here and the future of broadcast. In what we do, they're our primary competition, and they're formidable. But I think if you take a look at the kind of content that broadcast is increasingly specializing in, and the way consumer viewing habits are changing, also where the quality, and that's not to say there's not quality content on broadcast, but more and more of it increasingly is coalescing in the cable space. We tell marketers every day, yes, there's some advantages to being involved with broadcast if you want to reach the entire DMA, but if you take a look at what's happening to their local news content, if you take a look at the way that audiences are behaving in prime time from a multi-screen standpoint, it really is becoming an increasingly inferior choice, and there are much better options for ways that you can go out and reach audiences. What that means for the future of their, transmitters and things like that, I really can't say. But what I can tell you from a competitive standpoint, Jim, we are every day spend a lot of time talking about the activity in this space, and there's no question that the number of folks who are competing with the marketers that we deal with every day, and more broadly for the company with the eyeballs and the customers we service every day, is growing pretty exponentially. And I think it comes back to then for us, what we see is still a very strong value proposition out in the marketplace is a place where we have aggregated a tremendous amount of content, the best content available, whether it be the kind of entertainment content we've been talking about earlier. I think I can't emphasize enough the power that sports plays in the distribution realm right now, not only from a financial standpoint, but in an ability to aggregate audiences. That is live content. That is not DVR content. And the way our economic and business models work right now from a league standpoint, that is still going to flow through, cable and broadcast distribution for the foreseeable future. So I think, that is not going to change. I think other things may change over the next 5 or 6 years, but that will not. But I think what's also going to give us an advantage, I think, in what's hurting local broadcasts is what you, and someone said this earlier, and I think it's very smart, who owns the customer? And it's those insights. Well, we've got very strong relationships and insights, with 12 million plus customers across the country, and our fellow folks in the cable space can say similar. What we are really focusing on is helping marketers understand how those folks behave, and also helping content partners understand how they behave. Because I think it's very important. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard and read about how Netflix and Amazon are increasingly using data to drive their content. That in no way, from my perspective, sort of devalues the role of just a strong creative person to begin with. But to the extent that we can provide some context in terms of what kinds of programs people multitask around, how they behave across screen, and being that conduit into the household puts companies like ourselves in a strong position to have these kind of conversations about the future. And again, back to your original question, I think positions cable in a much more superior way from a long-term standpoint than whatever may happen with broadcast.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to comment on that question? If not, I'll move on to the next one. Start with Seth. Seth, what does ultra high definition, 4K and/or high dynamic range content mean for the future of video distribution? Is it going to be a big opportunity, or is it the next 3D?
Can I go back to the previous question because it got me
please.
off? Okay. So when Mitch was talking about disruptive technologies, I wanted to throw out a bunch more that were considered extremely disruptive. And at the time, he mentioned a few of them. FM radio was considered incredibly disruptive and was vigorously opposed by RCA, the Radio Corporation of America at the time, and NBC in its infancy, for potentially destroying the existing radio business as it was. Television was fought off for at least a decade for being disruptive to radio. As I think Mitch said, the VHS itself was viewed by Valenti and others as destroying the movie business. Obviously, the results were the reverse. iPod and iTunes were obviously viewed as tremendously disruptive. YouTube, right, was viewed as the thing that was potentially going to destroy the business. And it was interesting moments like when NBC actually allowed that Lazy Sunday clip to go forward as a promotional vehicle, that people started to realize, there's two edges to this sword. So I think a lot of these things are really difficult to fight, and you're better off not, because they wind up going to the law of unintended consequences. And to the extent that incumbents really try and fight things like music subscription off, I mean, I don't know if anybody here, maybe Mitch has an opinion on that, but to me, the stupidest thing that the music did in a long list of not incredibly wise things was not coming to some sort of an accommodation with Napster back when they could have, right? Napster could have become the universal paid radio station or subscription service for the music business 10 years earlier. I mean, the music revenues went from like 40 billion to 20 billion or something like that in that period from 2001, 2002 at the top onward down. They could have, by moving into it more quickly, saved themselves a lot of pain. And so, in terms of 4K, I mean, technology is obviously getting better, and the higher format, there's always going to be a group of people that want higher format content. Certainly consumer electronics guys are, because in the same sense that 3D worked this way, that game consoles work this way, for the same reason that Intel would invest in properties that required more chip cycles. Any company that has the opportunity to sell more devices based on a higher consumption of cycles is in good shape. But in some ways, I kind of think we can also argue the reverse. I mean, YouTube has done a pretty effective job, and so have the MCNs, on pretty, not optimal video quality, and they're growing really fast too. So I think the kind of the watchword for this is learning who your business model is, who your customer is, and targeting them. I don't think there is one panacea for everything anymore. 4K will work really well, and it's a great opportunity in certain circumstances, but so is really low-res video for other audiences.
Thanks, Seth. No, again, I love this issue of disruption, and sometimes you have to be careful about not fighting but co-opting, because it reminds me of the telephone, which was not considered disruptive by Western Union, the telegraph company. They said, why would you use a telephone? If someone's close enough, you just go to their house and talk to them, and if you want to communicate with someone in a different city, you send a telegram. And they turned down Alexander Graham Bell's patents. So you can be too complacent about disruptive technology. And also, Seth, we talked a little bit, but we should have a webinar on the Secure Digital Music Initiative with the Beck and C begging music to get online back in 98, 99, 2000, which was just hitting your head against a pillar. But let me move on to my next question. And this, Mitch, this is one I'm tossing right to you, which is, you know, and I know you have opinion, but I know what your answer will be, but I'd like to hear in detail why you think it's so. In the delivery of premium video services, do you see locker-based content purchases winning over streaming, or is it going to be a mixture of both?
Well, I don't think of locker-based access as download or streaming. I think the consumer ultimately has to decide what they want to do with the content. If they want to view it, it's going to be streaming. In fact, what we're finding in Ultraviolet with Ultraviolet users is a significant majority are streaming now. Very few are downloading. And in fact, when we started Ultraviolet, we thought it was going to be a download model, and that drove a lot of technical planning within the within DECE to develop, you know, common file formats for download, so consumers could access the file across all their devices by side loading from device to device. And within the last 4 years, streaming has completely taken over. It's all about access. It's not about download, even though there are some reasons to download. Again, you're flying somewhere, but the majority are streaming. So when I think of locker access, I really think of streaming services, and we're getting to the point now with H.265 and some new adaptive streaming models that we're going to have pretty high quality video streaming in very low bandwidth and challenged areas as well. I did want to comment though on, you know, for those who don't. I mean, you threw out enhanced dynamic range out there. I think most people on the webinar certainly know 4K and the resolution of 4K, but I'm not sure everybody knows what enhanced or high dynamic range is. And it's basically very bright contrast that they measure in what's called nits. Again, nits meaningless to me, meaningful to those who are in the industry. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about, in the movie theater, the brightness is about 48 nits. On Blu-ray, it's delivered at 100 nits, and we're talking about new television sets and new delivery that will be at 1,000 to 1,500 nits in the home. And it's in that contrast that you see a lot more resolution. So 1080p, which is standard high definition with high dynamic range, is something you can see across the room. The difference between 2K and 4K for most people probably won't see it. Even though every television set released will be 4K. It'll almost be in a couple years. Like today, you go out to and try to find a 720p display. They simply don't exist. It's going to be the same thing with 1080p. Everything's just going to be 4K. We're going to see programming that looks great on 4K, but my concern is you're sitting so far from the set in the average US home that it's going to be very, very difficult to see the difference between native 4K and scaled high def. But high dynamic range or enhanced dynamic range, you can actually see that across the room. And I think the future of television is enhanced or high dynamic range.
Yeah, I guess the human visual system reacts more to contrast and brightness than it does to more pixels.
That's right. I mean, it looks great with 4K too, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. But
when you think of, just to add one more thing, when you think of resolution, to me, it just means distance from the screen. Mm-hmm. So standard def means the optimal viewing distance is about 7 screen heights away from the screen. For high definition content, it's about 3 screen heights away. And for 4K, it's about 1.5 screen heights away. So if you buy a 55 or 65-inch 4K set, the optimal viewing distance is about 3 feet.
And unfortunately,
right. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
People's living rooms are still set up for the 480 interlace.
No, that's right. Even an 84-inch, which is a big 4K screen, the optimal viewing distance is 7 feet. So it just means you need a much bigger screen, and you need to sit much closer to actually get a true 4K experience.
Interesting. Thanks, Mitch. Emil, this one's for you, and obviously anyone else wants to chime in after you've thought, that's fine too. Do you see anytime soon a generation, and I'm using Apple TV as a broad term, not Apple TV in the sense of what's there, appearing, you know, which as Jobs famously claimed, he solved television, which I think was a tease before he left us. But do you see some device providing the smarts and navigation that consumers appear to want to solve their claimed problem? And I think, Seth, you went through 30 shows appearing right now out of probably 300 on your cable system. But, you know, the consumer complaint that I always hear is, oh, God, I got 300 channels of video, and there's nothing on I want to watch. Do you see that being solved anytime soon?
Well, I think soon is a relative term. You know, look, if you go back in your Wayback Machine, you think about the early days of the internet. You know, most ISPs would dial your modem, and they would stop making noise, and then your computer would be connected, and then you as the user needed to do something to instantiate some sort of context to your session. You needed to go to Yahoo's directory and find something, or you knew the website, or you saw the mistyped Toyota ad on the Super Bowl in 1996 and wanted to try to buy a Camry. And, you know, there was a discovery problem then, and I think we continue to have that same discovery problem, right? People who complain about having too many TV channels are generally the ones that don't realize that Google search results can go on for pages and pages and pages. I think that there's a lot of activity in the world right now trying to redefine what we'll loosely call the big screen television discovery and usage experience. We've seen a lot of CE manufacturers doing a lot of really interesting things over the last couple of months. You know, I continue to be impressed with the folks over at Fan Plus, formerly Fanhattan. If you guys haven't, if nobody's really seen that app, I mean, check it out. I've started using on my iPhone an app called TV Forecast, which has kind of replaced my TiVo, TiVo brand TiVo recommendations, just because I can get them on this device and I can sort of action based on that. But at the end of the day, I think we continue to have a variety of discovery problems, and I think a bunch of them are sort of going to be solved from a tech perspective. I think a bunch of them are sort of going to be solved from a content rights, metadata, ownership, and/or licensing perspective, and we're going to continue to have that third component, which is, hey Jim, did you see that show on TV last night? You really, really, really have to watch it. You know, as a big Breaking Bad fan, I didn't start watching Breaking Bad until halfway through season 3. It took people 4+ years of them convincing me that this show about these two lunatics cooking meth out of the back of an RV, you know, is worth making that time investment, right? So I still personally discover a lot of programming out there in that same way, and I don't think there's a tool in the world that would have convinced me to watch that, except, you know, 3 of my best friends in the world that know me best were like, "You're an idiot. You have to watch this show. It's incredible." And I don't think we're ever really going to have that replacement. I mean, if you really want to continue to draw analogs between sort of the video world and the music world, I guess that's why Spotify succeeds for me, because I have a bunch of friends who are super music nerds, and I can discover things based on their behavior and their patterns and their playlists. And maybe there's an analog television product out there that 4 or 5 people are trying to solve right now. But I don't think that there's a magic bullet discovery tool. I don't think that there's a magic bullet business tool that sort of solves the notion of, well, I want to subscribe to it because it's a value, but it's a James Bond movie, so I want to own it forever. I can't tell you how many formats I own all the James Bond movies in, from VHS to DVD to Blu-ray to iTunes download. And by the way, you know, I work at Epic, so I kind of have access to that nonsense. But you know, I still pay for them because as a collector, as a human, that's my behavior, and that's what I want to replicate. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of these challenges. But you know, from where I sit, you know, I see a lot of smart people trying to solve these problems, and I'm really eager to see, you know, kind of what happens next.
Thanks, Emil. Does anybody else want to comment on that? That's a fascinating topic for me.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think Emil hit on the.
Go ahead, Seth.
Okay, sorry. I think Emil hit on probably the greatest example of a lot of unintended consequences in terms of disruption breaking in a good way that we have, which is Breaking Bad from its beginning was conceived as a very linear construction, which obviously is not usual for television, right? The old generations and generations of TV have been about 4-wall, and you can come in anywhere you want and catch up the story. Breaking Bad was the opposite of that, and the data indicates that the growth of the show probably was somewhere between 30 and 45% enhanced by that Netflix relationship and exactly what Emil described, which is people went into work and they said, you got to see this show. But that's a pretty difficult show to come in on the middle of. And so it was this kind of new business model brought about by, you know, the hybridization of business models that allowed that kind of a thing to happen. So I think that's a great example. Just really quickly also on your other question, Jim, I think a part of the discovery issue is about a real paradigm shift, and that's the move from an EPG legacy world to a search-based world, right? So to some extent, MVPDs and a lot of technologies are still based in some form of a linear grid guide, and that just doesn't get you to where you need to go in the world that we're going to. So as you know, like sort of accommodation of the company in the world that least needs it, one of the services that really has done a great job is X1. It is the new Comcast Xfinity by X1 platform, which really has done a great job of combining catch-up service stuff where you can come into the middle of a show and it'll pull the first half off of a server down and allow you to search via relational databases and find stuff that's related to the stuff that you want now. I think that's a really great thing for sort of the MVPD world. And I think also along where Emil was going, metadata has to catch up with that, right? Content providers and this entire soup and world economy of content providers has to start coming up with more common nomenclatures in order for this content to be tagged, because there's so much stuff out there that people would love if they could only find it. And it's metadata that's going to do that.
Thanks, Seth. That's funny because it just relates to a question from one of our listeners or viewers, that is. I'm so used to radio, right? And I'm going to direct this at Fred and then let some others, because Fred started it, and I think, Seth, you may have some ideas too. But this is from Dan Sweeney, who asks, what kinds of data analytics are/will be needed beyond Nielsen to accurately identify TV/web TV audiences and demos, as in demographics, I assume?
That's a great question, and I appreciate Dan asking that. The way we've attacked this here is trying to look at the way audiences are segmented. So the traditional Nielsen 25 to 54, male, female, etc., is clearly, you know, in a much more data-driven age. If you're a marketer, that is clearly insufficient in terms of understanding how you can reach and motivate, you know, your consumers. So I think the way we look at it here at Time Warner Cable, we've been able to create what we call TV tribes, which is essentially looking at looking at our set-top box data and grouping folks both based on location, but also based on program affinity. So it's very similar to people are talking about Spotify and music. I think it's a very good corollary. You know, their musical tribes, etc. This is around television viewing, and we think this is, you know, potentially incredibly powerful and frankly gold for marketers, because while yes, we should all talk about what is happening and where the industry is going, I think it's important to note that people spend 160 plus hours a month watching television. They're spending 5 hours a day watching television. Right now, in the business that we're in, which is helping marketers connect with audiences, it is still the best way to do that and drive demand, discovery, awareness. Frankly, a lot of the biggest advertisers out there are digital companies because they recognize, in terms of being able to drive demand and create awareness and discovery, television remains that critical piece. So for us, in looking at these tribes, we've been able to look at not only what they watch, but the context around that, where they live, their demographic information, what their multi-screen behavior is, how that varies. So, for example, you know, we have a tribe that we call Monday Morning Quarterbacks, and that's essentially, you know, a sports fans and a particularly passionate group of sports fans. But what they watch, in addition, we all know Monday Morning Quarterbacks will watch sports across different markets, but other programming that they watch, other places that they go online, how they engage socially, will vary upon market. So you're starting to give marketers some insights at a very local level. I don't want to say household level, but at a much more contextual level to understand what is the right way to drive to position your creative, to message to those people, and in terms of what kind of programming you want to be in, it gives them much more insight than what has been the traditional model to date. So we are as anxious as anybody for these kind of data and insights, metrics, and our peers in the space in cable and satellite also, et cetera, are moving towards this as well. That really trying to have a lot of much deeper data than what we're getting now. Because frankly, also, if you just look at Nielsen, for example, a lot of our content providers are being underserved. There are formidable audiences watching programming that are not really measuring a Nielsen rating. And I'll tell you, without going on in too much depth, one of the secrets of the success, and we own a large part of the Ohio market for the Obama campaign in the last presidential election, was understanding that you don't just advertise on 5 networks, you advertise on 20, 25 networks. They were buying inventory on TV land a week before the election. Unheard of. That was based on social set-top box data, which we were part of providing, which allowed them to see that if you have voters who lean Democratic but are somewhat apolitical, hitting them with the right kind of message can spur activity, was one of the reasons why they were successful. If you take a look at the polling data, wasn't matching that because these people were not being captured, in those form of measurement. So there's a lot of exciting work being done in this area. We're proud to be kind of leading in that space, but I think it's a great question because ultimately, if you're a marketer and what they're demanding of us, I think ultimately from Nielsen, and I think this is also going to be a challenge for the broadcasters, is I need to know more about your audiences. Just advertising across scale, across a large footprint is great, but there's a lot of nuances there. There's a lot of competition for their eyeball. What can you tell me about them and how they behave differently so I can be more successful?
Great, that's a great answer. Thanks, Fred. Mitch?
Yeah, I want to go back to some of the comments by Emil and Seth because I think they were both really right on a couple things. That linear program guide is in the past. It's going to be a lot more based on search. I absolutely agree. If you haven't seen Fan UI, it's pretty phenomenal. They've done a really good job. And I've even seen another UI by another company that's going to be launching shortly. Their UI is kind of very Nest thermostat-like. It knows what you watched. It knows where you left off. It knows what to present in a user guide. So you can instantly kind of catch up where you were, or including recommendation engines. And then on top of that, something I talked about earlier, and I think we all talk about, the ability to have catch-up television, which did, by the fact, on Netflix kind of launch Breaking Bad. It was interesting that also the 4th season of Seinfeld is what launched that, but that was a water cooler social launch, which was all around an episode called The Contest. So both had late season starts. But some very interesting dynamics are happening because there are some business models that have catch-up television where you can catch up from the very beginning. There are other business models with catch-up television like Netflix that allows you to watch the whole episode after the season's over. And there are some that allow you can only go back 5 episodes. And those are very, very interesting concepts because one could argue that the series that is licensed that allows you to catch up all episodes during the season has less value to a Netflix, for example, that wants you to catch up, that has the rights after the season. And we may actually see, as a business result of that Netflix may be willing to pay a lot more if you don't allow catch-up during the season for all episodes. And we're going to see how a true business relationship may actually limit consumer choice because of just the sheer financial of producing content and the additional fees that some licensees may be willing to pay. We'll see how disruptive that is, but it'll be interesting to see whether the network programmers, the owners of content, actually limit catch-up because there's a big payday if they do that.
Well, that is interesting, Mitch, and I think you were right on about saying the consumers might not be happy with it. I have to tell you, we binge watched at our household House of Cards. Once we started, watched 2 episodes, and my wife would say, "Oh no, we got to watch another third." And of course, it's
yeah. I think Jim, that's the worst thing that's ever happened, and yet it's the best thing. I love binging, and I friggin' hate it because I find myself at 4 in the morning just one more.
Right.
Not healthy.
So we've got a question. I'm not sure who to ask this, so hopefully someone will volunteer or I'll force someone to answer. This is from a friend of ours, Phil Lelyville, and he's asking, how is the industry dealing with mashup culture? What is being tested for monetizing fragments? Who could take that?
I think I'll go really quick. I think it's an inevitable consequence. And in other places, first of all, in the YouTube MCN world, you already see just how important annotation it is. So we just had a couple guys at our event at the Academy, Nice Peter and Epic Lloyd from Epic Rap Battles of History, who I think are really brilliant. They've got 8 of the 10 most commented videos in history. and it's because they've created a culture and an art form that really encourages that. I think if you go to Asia, you see a lot more meta layer and meta layer and meta layer on top of stuff. I don't think anybody's got a concrete answer on how that's going to play out. I think that art will drive it, and then commerce will hopefully, somebody will come in opportunistically and figure out a way to derive revenue about it. But up until that point, hopefully, you know, people let it run as a potential marketing asset and see where it goes.
Yeah, go ahead, Mitch. But Mitch, before we start, I just want to say one thing about all this, which is very interesting, and this isn't the place to talk about it. There's very interesting legal issues here, and their case came out yesterday in New York about using pieces of other shows in your film that found that it was a fair use. So it's going to be a fascinating legal question as well. Sorry, go ahead, Mitch.
Well, the fair use of it all and the copyright of it all is one issue. But I've often thought, and by the way, Phil, thank you for the question. Really good question. You know, that we think of music ringtones, and many of us wonder how it ever got to be a $4 or $6 billion business as a blip. But what a nice blip to have if you're an industry looking back. And I would love to see video ringtones where your favorite piece of video comes up as a way to mash up something, a small clip, and monetize it. And you're probably never going to see that because with respect to motion picture content or television content, the SAG agreement basically says that if you use someone in a clip, you actually have to get their approval. And you can't get pre-approval in their initial agreement. And the penalty for that is 3 times what they were paid in the clip. So if you took like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who maybe got paid $20 million long ago and he worked 20 days, arguably if you use the clip, you might owe him under the SAG agreement $3 million if it's not being used for marketing and promotion. So we might see we do see marketing and promotion stuff come up, but the use of a clip with an identifiable individual, and there are also issues in the WGA and the DGA guild agreements as well. But mashups for commercial are going to be very, very difficult since you need prior consent from the artist who appears in the clip. And I'd like to see them get smarter about it. But then again, there may be some clips that you don't want to license. I'm sure Sharon Stone, for example, has a few seconds of a clip that she wouldn't want licensed and used as a video ringtone. So maybe there's good reason for it.
Yeah, well, that's again brings you to the Garcia copyright case and the Alla film. So this is fascinating both in the legal and in the video world. Phil's asked another question. I think he's looking over my shoulder at my list of questions because I'm asking something similar. Phil, I hope you'll forgive me for reading my question, but I think it subsumes yours. And I'm going to start with Emil, but I think this is for everybody. You know, gaming seems to be an increasing way people consume video. I don't mean the craps tables. I mean playing virtual reality games. And virtual reality itself with, is it called Optima? I forget the name of the glasses that I tried.
Oculus.
Oculus, yeah. They thank you. They seems to be catching on. So what role, if any, do you see for traditional video distributors, or is gaming just a whole independent part of video consumption and the technology of virtual reality? Where do you see that fitting in? I'm going to start with Emil and see what he thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things with that as well. You know, I think that the real driver for those kinds of technologies are going to be with the core owners of the IP. You know, at Epix, we're downstream licensors, essentially. I mean, you know, we may be first in line, but we are ultimately a downstream licensor. So from our perspective, you know, that kind of falls out of our bailiwick on a day-to-day basis, right? But, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if big IP owners like the folks in the Transformers world are looking at really pushing the envelope with those kinds of technologies as they roll into the hands of consumers. You know, from a distribution perspective, I mean, I can really only speculate as a consumer, and you know, my consumer tendency tells me that it just means I'm going to be writing a bigger check to Time Warner Cable every month because I'm going to need more bandwidth. You know, if there are services that try to you know, aggregate games on a subscription basis, I believe America Online tried that. That was actually their original business prior to launching online services. But Atari had gone bankrupt. If we really want to go play the history game, you know. I look at things like Steam, and to a much lesser extent maybe Origin, as the potential source for that kind of product. I mean, it's kind of where it lives in consumer mindsets, and if I have my Oculus, it would make more sense for me as a human to connect it to my Steam account and download those model those worlds and do that massively multiplayer online role-playing game on a virtual reality perspective through my very high-speed internet connection at home. So I don't really know exactly who's gonna move into that space and try to aggregate that content and provide some value to consumers, but I think it's part of the next wave of stuff. Having spent a little bit of time with the Oculus hardware, it's pretty damn cool. I mean, it's bizarre, and it's all the things that you've read about in terms of how immersive it is. And I don't know. Let's see what happens over the next couple of years.
Mitch?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's not a technology issue. I think it's going to be more of a business-related issue to see how it rolls out, because if it stays niche, then it may not pay to create the content, because no one's going to pay to create the content unless they can actually sell it. And sometimes when those decisions are made, you have to make sure that you're not going to produce something that loses money. I mean, we face that with 4K today in post. Special effects are still done in 2K, and then it's scaled up to 4K because to do special effects in 2K is expensive enough. And now you're talking about 4K, which is 4 times the number of bits. Someone's going to do it like a James Cameron, but how do you monetize that? And I think it's the same thing with some of the virtual reality games. The question is going to become, how much does it cost to actually create it, and can we monetize it? And if you can't, I'm not sure it's going to be created, even though the technology would seem to certainly support it.
Actually, I got to hit Fred with this, which is, you talked about sports. Could you imagine sort of a great now I forget the name of those shows, reality shows, which don't apparently cost much to produce unless they're not really reality. But could you imagine, championships of some of these games, and actually people wanting to watch people play?
Well,
the best of.
I think I think the people at Amazon, buy into that, given their purchase this week, and I think in other parts of the world, particularly in South Korea, those are aggregating significant audiences. I think for us, here at Time Warner Cable, there's 2 things we look at. One, we want to make sure that from a consumer standpoint, we're able to provide people access to the content they want on any device. So if you're in a closed environment like an Xbox, for example, we've been leaders in trying to make sure that content can be available there for them to enjoy, and then helping our advertisers and marketers understand what that means. But then more broadly speaking, for folks who are gaming online and through Wi-Fi, et cetera, again, comes back to the access we have into the home, and what does that mean? And how do we, obviously, and I should preface all of this by saying that consumer privacy for us is paramount across on any platform. But then trying to understand what we know about how people are behaving, when they're online, and usually they're doing more than one thing, right? I think we all know that. That's probably how all of us behave, and what are the implications of that?
I've just realized I'm having too good a time because we're flying by and only have a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is see each of you can take 1 minute to tell me, your final thoughts, and I'm just going to go down my pictures here and start with Emil.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, doing a digital Hollywood panel in the office is never a good idea because people are standing there acting like things are important.
I have a sign on my door.
Anyway, I think again, from our perspective at Epix, our goal is to try to work with folks to get them the most flexible grant of right to in-demand studio product that we can. We try to be flexible. We try to work with folks for various and sundry new initiatives that they've got. I think you're going to start to see a lot of cutting-edge products coming out from not just the dangerous internet disruptive OTT players, but a lot of the MSO partners that we've got really, really good relationships with are really pushing the envelope. I would advise everybody to pay attention to their audiences, both directly and indirectly. Watch what they're doing, watch what they're paying for, and do your best to deliver a product that satisfies those needs.
Thank you, Emil. Fred, final thoughts?
Yeah, I just echo what Emil said. The consumer is paramount. So understanding the consumer experience, how we can enhance upon that, and I think one thing I didn't talk about, but again, I think is important for us is being able to provide that access to great content wherever they are. So I think to the extent that we can, as I referenced, being able to deliver content over other platforms, whether it be Roku devices, Xboxes, etc., improving the experience from a discovery standpoint. But then also being able to, from a TV everywhere perspective in an app-based world, IPTV, allowing consumers to access the content. I think, as an industry, we still obviously have work to do there, but all the metrics are pointing in the right direction, and the growth is coming exponentially. And so I think, for our challenge, again, it all comes back to great content, great consumers, and the data that you can surround them with to help people make good decisions about how they program, but also how marketers reach that audience. That's going to be, the ingredients for success as we move forward.
Thank you, Fred. Mitch?
Wow. My feeling on this is that we're going to look back at 2014 and we're going to say, do you remember a time when you bought content and the only thing you could do is watch it? I don't even think we're close to taking advantage yet of what consumers could do with content. We certainly haven't seen viral distribution take off like it could. We haven't seen the social impact on recommendations and how we're going to actually find content. And I think what we're going to see over the next few years is, I hope what we're going to find is that the things that I can do with the things that I love are going to expand far beyond watching it.
Great, thanks, Mitch. And Seth, you have, other than me, the last word.
I like where he was going with that, so I'm going to continue it. I think that part of the embedded conversation that's really critical to appreciate to what Mitch was saying, what everybody's saying, and to Phil's question earlier about mashups is we are not in the world in this industry that we were in 20 years ago. It is not an industry run by one town. It's a global business, and so to the extent that there are IP issues or other issues or business model issues that may make something ineffective from a cost perspective in the United States, that doesn't mean they're not going to happen. And so I think increasingly we're going to start seeing those kind of models, whether they're more tactile or they're more immersive. I have a friend in Europe who will not watch a movie without Oculus on. He says it's too thin and it takes him outside of the experience. He's just watching it on Oculus. I think a lot of these platforms and these services that we think will sound really great, they will happen. But the catch is they may not happen here because of our situation. I guess the place I would leave that is if you think about the way that the Walt Disney canon was built, right, from an IP perspective, Walt Disney was able to capitalize on a lot of stuff that was in the public domain from the Brothers Grimm and others. If Walt Disney had come along later and tried to make a bunch of movies on IP that he didn't own, he would have been shut down immediately. And so I think that there are factors that move some of us elsewhere in the world, and it's going to be really interesting to watch those services emerge in Asia and elsewhere, and then to try and sort of do an answer wrap with them from Hollywood.
Sorry about the videos getting a little bit weird. Listen, I want to thank each of you. This was a terrific panel. This was a very, very rich discussion. Emil, Fred, Seth, and Mitch, thank you very much. I'm just going to close reading one of our final comments by one of our listeners. Charlene Hartwell says, really enjoying the @D Hollywood Live panel. The whole notion of disruption in media is rampant with implications. Thank you all again. This has been really terrific, and thank you in the audience. Bye now.
Thank you.